The command rang through the courtroom with sharp authority, slicing through the tension that had settled over the room like a storm cloud. Kody Brown rose slowly from his chair, his fists clenched tight as he tried to project calm. But his face, so often smug and self-assured in front of cameras, revealed something very different now: fear. This was not an episode of Sister Wives. This was not Flagstaff, and it certainly was not another family meeting where he could dominate the conversation. This was a real courtroom, with a real judge, and 3 of the 4 women who had once stood beside him were now facing him as opponents. They were no longer quiet, no longer obedient, and no longer willing to protect the illusion. For more than a decade, America had watched Kody Brown present himself as the head of an unusual, but functioning plural family. Viewers saw a man with 4 wives, 18 children, and a sprawling household built on faith, sacrifice, and the promise of unity. He was often criticized, sometimes mocked, but never ignored. Audiences tuned in year after year to see how he balanced the needs of Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin. Mary was the first wife, once the legal and emotional foundation of the family. Janelle was practical, composed, and financially dependable. Christine was warm, expressive, and devoted to the children. Robin, the youngest of the wives, appeared increasingly to hold Kody's deepest loyalty. On television, the family was framed as complicated but committed, a portrait of plural marriage held together by faith and perseverance. But away from the cameras, the fractures had widened. And now those fractures had exploded into open legal warfare. The courthouse was packed. Outside, media crews circled like vultures. Fans of the show held signs, shouted opinions, and waited for scraps of reaction. Some believed Kody was finally getting what he deserved. Others insisted he was being unfairly attacked by bitter former wives. But inside that courtroom, none of the noise mattered. What mattered was the truth. On one side sat Kody, flanked by his legal team, trying to hold on to the image that had once served him so well. On the other side sat Christine, Janelle, and Mary. They were not seated as sister wives anymore. They were plaintiffs. What had once been framed as a spiritual family arrangement had now become, in the eyes of the court, a tangled conflict involving finances, emotional harm, broken promises, and the welfare of children. Robin's absence that day did not go unnoticed. The empty space where she should have been seemed to carry its own message. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, looked over the room with cool, practiced eyes. When she spoke, her voice was steady and unsparing. She made it clear that this case was not simply about the breakdown of a marriage. It was about spiritual exploitation, shared finances, emotional equity, and the collapse of a family that had been publicly marketed as united. Her words fell over the courtroom like a warning bell. Christine's attorney was the first to rise. She wasted no time softening the blow. Instead, she began laying out pieces of evidence that struck at the heart of the image Kody had spent years constructing. She read from journals. She introduced clips from the family's television show. She referenced private audio recordings and public statements in which Kody dismissed the needs of his wives while openly favoring Robin. One line, read aloud in court, silenced the room, Kody saying he did not owe anyone an apology for who he loved more, and that he was not running a democracy. It was the kind of statement that might once have passed as blunt honesty on television. In court, it sounded cold, arrogant, and devastating. Christine sat with her hands folded, her face steady but unreadable. Her attorney argued that her client had been emotionally neglected, deceived under the guise of spiritual commitment, and financially trapped inside a system that consistently privileged one wife over the others. Then came the first major shock. Christine was not simply seeking separation. She was asking the court to recognize that the family's financial structure had been coercive and abusive. Her case centered on emotional abuse, custody of her younger child, and financial mismanagement. Though Kody had only a legal marriage with Robin, all of the wives had contributed to what was presented as a shared family life. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button and join our YouTube family. Thank you for your support. Income from the television show, book deals, paid appearances, and business ventures had all flowed into accounts that were supposedly meant to support the family as a whole. A forensic financial analyst later testified that millions of dollars earmarked for shared family use had either gone unexplained or had been diverted into Robyn's residence, her business ventures, and accounts controlled by Kody. The implication was devastating. Christine's team demanded a freeze on family assets and a full audit of the family trust and shared accounts. Kody's attorney tried to push back. He painted the women as resentful, emotional, and influenced by media narratives. He insisted Kody was being punished simply for loving openly and making difficult family choices. Then Kody himself stood to address the court. Straightening his jacket, he attempted to recover the confidence that had once made him so compelling on television. He told the court he had never forced anyone into this lifestyle. They had chosen it, he said. He had done his best to keep the family together. And if he spent more time with Robyn, it was because she needed more from him. If the others drifted away, that was their decision. The judge was unmoved. She asked a direct question. Had he ever legally protected the interests of the other wives? Did they receive deeds, legal ownership, or business shares? Kody hesitated. Finally, he admitted they had not. They had, he said, been united by faith. The judge's response landed hard. Faith, she said, is not a contract. In her courtroom, emotional manipulation hidden behind religious language would not serve as a defense. Outside, the headlines were already forming. Reports described financial freezes, custody demands, and a family empire under investigation. Inside the courtroom, the judge temporarily froze all known family accounts pending investigation. Kody was barred from selling property. His business income was ordered into escrow. Christine left the courthouse with a subdued look of relief, not triumph. In her statement to the press, she said she was not acting out of anger. She was trying to protect herself and her children. For too long, she said, they had lived under one man's vision. Now it was time to protect their own future. As Kody exited, cameras swarmed around him. He said nothing. He did not smile. The man who had once commanded a reality television empire walked alone to his car, followed only by the sound of shouted questions and the weight of legal consequences now gathering around him. But that was only the beginning. For years, Kody Brown had been cast as the sweet and cheerful third wife, the nurturing mother with a bright smile and a cooperative attitude. Viewers had seen her bake, homeschool, laugh nervously through tense family moments, and try to hold emotional chaos together with optimism. But beneath the smiles was a woman who had endured years of emotional abandonment, gaslighting, and spiritual manipulation. And unlike the explosive public confrontations people might have expected, Christine had not lashed out. She had watched. She had documented. She had quietly prepared. Her filing shocked everyone because it was not merely emotional. It was strategic. She sought separation based on emotional trauma and spiritual abandonment, but she also came armed with lawyers, child psychologists, financial documents, and a media strategy. Her attorney argued that Christine had entered a spiritual marriage under the promise of equality and family unity, only to find herself pushed aside as Robyn became the center of Kody's emotional and practical life. The evidence piled up quickly. Emails, journal entries, screenshots, and video clips formed a picture of a relationship deteriorating in public and in private. Some of the most damaging evidence came from the family's own television show. What had once served as the polished public face of plural marriage had become a documented archive of neglect and rejection. In one of the most painful clips shown in court, Kody openly stated that he no longer wanted intimacy with Christine and was not willing to fake feelings he did not have. In the courtroom, those words were no longer television drama. They became evidence of abandonment. Christine's legal team focused especially on Truly, her younger daughter. They argued that after Christine moved to Utah, Kody had largely withdrawn from Truly's life. Missed appointments, missed holidays, missed milestones. The pattern suggested not simple distance, but disengagement. A therapist testified that Truly showed signs of emotional confusion and instability tied to her father's inconsistent presence. Christine asked for full custody, supervised visitation, and child support retroactive to the date of separation. Kody's side insisted he was trying his best. But the judge cut through the excuse with a sharp observation. A father could not claim effort when the evidence suggested prolonged withdrawal. Christine's financial claims were equally serious. She had contributed to family homes in Las Vegas and Arizona. She had helped build the family brand through years of filming, promotion, and labor. Yet, because she had never been legally married to Kody, she lacked legal ownership over much of what she had helped support. Her attorney framed it simply: Christine had given decades of her life to a system that promised equality and delivered exclusion. She now sought a share of the value she had helped create. Then came another twist. Christine's camp sought a gag order, accusing Kody of speaking publicly in ways that defamed her, manipulated public opinion, and even compromised Truly's privacy. Screenshots from podcasts, interviews, and online commentary were introduced. The judge reviewed the filings and imposed a temporary silence order on both sides until the custody issues could be resolved. When Christine finally testified in her own words, the entire courtroom seemed to lean in. There was no glamour, no production lighting, no television framing. Just a mother speaking plainly. She said she had tried to be the perfect sister wife. She had believed in the family. She had believed Kody loved them equally. But over time, he made her feel small, burdensome, and disposable. She said she left not for revenge, but for peace, and that now she was fighting for her daughter. Kody's cross-examination did not help him. He was asked why he missed holidays, why he failed to secure Christine any legal ownership, and why he seemed to prioritize Robyn's household over the others. His answers wavered. He blamed Christine for withdrawing. The judge cut in with a pointed question of her own. Had Christine become defiant, or had she simply become self-sufficient? The distinction hung in the room like a blade. By the end of the session, the court issued a preliminary ruling. Christine was granted temporary full custody of Truly. Kody was limited to supervised bi-weekly visitation. A financial mediator would review her claims. A non-disparagement order was entered to stop both sides from publicly escalating the conflict. Christine walked out of that courtroom with her head high. It was not the posture of someone who had won a war. It was the posture of someone finally escaping one. Then it was Janelle's turn. If Christine's case was built on emotional truth, Janelle's was built on numbers. Calm, methodical, and devastating, she entered the courtroom carrying spreadsheets, tax records, contracts, wire transfers, and documentation that would hit Kody where he was least prepared: the money. For years, Janelle had been the practical one. She managed bills. She worked steadily. She believed in the family's long-term goals. She trusted that the sacrifices she made would one day result in security for everyone. Instead, she discovered that the dream had been built on shifting sand. Before filing, Janelle had quietly hired a forensic accountant. She turned over years of bank records, family account statements, and income documentation tied to the show, speaking engagements, book revenue, and business ventures. What came back was deeply troubling. Large sums of family income appeared to have been redirected into accounts controlled by Kody and, in some cases, Robyn. Payments linked to Robyn's home and business expenses stood out sharply against the family's supposed claim of shared sacrifice. When Janelle's legal team presented its case, it did so without theatrics. They showed deposits she had made, withdrawals she could not explain, and records that failed to show any reimbursement for the many shared expenses she had carried. At one point, the judge stopped to ask whether Janelle was truly saying that she had contributed to homes, property, and family ventures while her name appeared on virtually no legal documents. Janelle answered quietly that yes, that was exactly what had happened. They had all been told everything belonged to the family. But in the end, it all seemed to settle under Kody and Robyn's control. One of the fiercest disputes centered on Coyote Pass. The Arizona property Kody had persuaded the family to purchase with promises of future homes and shared legacy. Janelle testified that she had invested heavily in the land, believing she would eventually live there. Instead, the property stalled, taxes and expenses accumulated, and evidence suggested that plans had quietly shifted toward privileging Robin's future while excluding the others. Emails, proposals, and zoning documents were introduced showing plans tied to Robin's name while the other wives remained absent from the paperwork. Janelle's attorney argued that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. The dream of a shared future had been used to secure money and obedience, then quietly redirected. Though Janelle rarely presented herself as emotional, the hurt in her testimony was unmistakable. She said she had stayed loyal, worked consistently, and trusted Kody's promises. In the end, she felt she had been used not only as a wife, but as a source of funding. It was one of the sharpest lines spoken in court, and it landed exactly as intended. Kody's legal team argued that the family's financial arrangements had always been loose and voluntary. They insisted emotional grievances did not create legal liability. But Janelle's attorney replied that the Brown family functioned not just as a spiritual household, but as a business operation hidden behind religious language. In that context, informal promises and induced contributions could not simply be brushed aside. The judge appeared to agree that this was no longer merely a family matter. It had become a question of fairness, reliance, and financial control. She ordered a forensic audit of the family's finances over the prior decade, appointed a mediator, and maintained freezes on shared assets until further review. Then one more surprise surfaced. Janelle's attorney introduced an email allegedly showing Kody discussing the possibility of shifting the family brand toward a spin-off centered on his life with Robin, months before Christine had even formally left. If true, it suggested he had already been planning not only emotional separation, but financial and narrative separation as well, cutting the other wives out of the future while still benefiting from their present labor. The impact on Kody was visible. The self-assured patriarch who once presented himself as misunderstood now looked increasingly cornered. The allegations were no longer vague complaints from disappointed wives. They were organized, documented, and escalating. By the time the session ended, even outside observers understood that the case had transformed. It was no longer just about heartbreak. It was about money, control, image, and the consequences of structuring an entire family around one man's shifting loyalties. Then the courtroom prepared for yet another chapter. Mary, long considered the quietest and most complicated figure in the family, was waiting for her turn. For years she had stood at the edges of the family story, often isolated, often humiliated, but still somehow tethered to the structure that had excluded her. If Christine brought emotional force and Janelle brought financial precision, Mary's testimony promised something else entirely, the slow ache of someone who had been discarded while still being expected to stay loyal. And hanging over all of it was the final question the public could not stop asking. How would the judge rule when all the testimony, all the evidence, and all the years of private pain had finally been dragged into the open? When the final day of the trial arrived, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed. The legal arguments were nearly complete. The documents had been filed. The experts had testified. Now the court was poised to deliver what many believed would be a decision not just about one family, but about power, accountability, and the limits of spiritual authority when it crossed into control. "All rise," the bailiff called. The room stood as the judge entered. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. Kody stood rigid, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Christine sat beside her attorney, calm but tense. Janelle stared forward with hard focus. Mary looked nervous but composed. Robin, now present, stood close to her own legal counsel, pale and visibly shaken. The judge adjusted his glasses and began. He acknowledged the extraordinary complexity of the case. This was not, he said, a simple divorce or custody dispute. It was a deeply entangled conflict involving plural marriage, family manipulation, finances, and testimony pointing toward emotional abuse and coercive control. He stated that while the law could not undo pain, it could impose boundaries and deliver a measure of justice. He started with the financial findings. The court found that Kody had mismanaged shared family resources and had used funds contributed by multiple wives in ways that primarily benefited Robyn's household. These included housing costs, private expenditures, and legal expenses that had not been approved by all parties who had contributed to the family income pool. The court treated this as a breach of trust in the context of a shared financial arrangement. Restitution was ordered, with hundreds of thousands of dollars to be distributed among Christine, Janelle, and Mary based on their individual contributions and losses. Gasps rippled through the room. Then the judge turned to the children. While many of the Brown children were adults, the court found that the remaining minors' emotional well-being had been affected by the instability, favoritism, and inconsistent paternal involvement described throughout the trial. Referring to the psychologist's report, the judge concluded that supervised visitation would be required for a set period, with the mothers retaining custody and primary guardianship. But the most explosive portion of the ruling concerned emotional abuse. The judge stated that although the court had not heard evidence of physical violence, it had heard overwhelming testimony of emotional coercion, religious manipulation, and a repeated pattern of control presented as spiritual leadership. Based on that record, the court imposed mandatory psychological counseling and issued protective limitations regarding contact in specific circumstances involving Christine and her minor children. At that point, the emotional restraint that had held so many people together throughout the trial began to crack. Christine cried. Janelle's eyes filled. Robyn sat stunned. Kody, who had spent years shaping the family narrative, now seemed unable to control any part of it. As reporters rushed to transmit headlines and the courtroom slowly emptied, the real meaning of the moment settled in. This was not merely the collapse of a television family. It was the collapse of a system in which loyalty had been demanded without protection, sacrifice had been expected without fairness, and love had too often been conditional. In the weeks and months that followed, public reaction was fierce. Commentators argued over the intersection of religion, family structure, media exploitation, and emotional abuse. Some saw the ruling as a broader reckoning over patriarchal control disguised as spiritual duty. Others viewed it as the inevitable implosion of a family that had been breaking apart in public for years. For the women, however, the legal outcome represented something more personal than public symbolism. It was the end of silence. Christine began rebuilding her life with a new sense of peace. Janelle focused on reclaiming financial and emotional independence. Mary, long overshadowed, finally found space to tell her own story. And for the first time in years, none of them had to bend themselves around Kody's version of family. As for Kody, his final words outside the courthouse were subdued and almost unrecognizable from the man viewers had known. He said he had loved his family. He said he had only wanted to do what was right. But even in that moment, the weight of the trial made one thing painfully clear: intentions no longer mattered as much as consequences. Because in the end, the court was not judging how loudly someone claimed to love their family. It was judging how they treated them. Thanks for watching this video. Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell.